The world is becoming more diverse. The question is, are we the people of God becoming more united? I'm Alex Diaz. Welcome to Mosaix Today with Rachel and Mark. On each episode of this podcast, you'll discover unique insights, hear from credible practitioners, and learn promising practices to help you build a healthy, multi-ethnic, culturally intelligent, socially just, and financially sustainable church. The kingdom of God is not segregated. Why on earth is the church? And now, here's your host, Rachel and Mark.
Hello and welcome to our latest episode of Mosaix Today with Rachel and Mark. We have a special guest with us. George is here talking about his latest book, Beyond Racial Division. And this is our second season of Mosaix Today. So we're so glad that you're continuing on with us in this journey. If you didn't catch the very first episode of season 2, you definitely want to check that out. George was unpacking anti-racism with us. We learned a lot, grew a lot through that conversation. And now we're here today to talk about that other spectrum from anti-racism, which is color blindness. So thank you so much for being here with us, George. And Mark, it's always great to see you.
Likewise, Rachel. It was great to actually meet you in person recently in the Phoenix Valley, where, of course, you know I grew up and still have a home in Scottsdale. So super excited about you and your husband, Brandon, now being pastors there at Central United Methodist downtown Phoenix. And George, of course, you and I go back to 2004. Folks, if you didn't know, George and I are the co-founders of Mosaix Global Network. He was deeply embedded in this and then turned his attention around 2010 or so to anti-Christian bias and college campus and university. But as you know, George, the Lord wouldn't let you away. We're so glad to have you in a sense back engaged, back in this movement. And thank you for all your time. We're doing a 3-part series right now, as Rachel mentioned. The first one on anti-racism, got into a little bit of the distinction with CRT in that one. Now we're talking today about color blindness, which is part of the binary that George points out in his latest book coming out next year, February 2022, Beyond Racial Division. And then, of course, in our next and final third part, we're going to talk about his third path, if you will, that is of mutual accountability. So, George, let's talk about color blindness.
Color blindness is basically the idea that the best way to deal with racism is ignore race. So that if I don't see your race, then I can't mistreat you because of your race. And, it is not saying that there aren't racists, but it is saying that by and large, we have solved the problem of racism. That there's a few races out there. Most people who do colorblindness will admit there's a few races out there. But by and large, in the ideology of colorblindness, we all have an equal chance to get whatever we want, and our race no longer matters. And so that's the basic idea behind colorblindness. And that's what people who advocate for colorblindness basically argue.
You know, back in the 80s, I think I told you this, Rachel, in the lead up to this, I was a card-carrying member of that. When I got involved, I was in my early 20s. I went to a Billy Graham crusade in Portland. I was a young youth pastor. I was card-carrying, wore the T-shirt, God doesn't see color. I'm very thankful that I have evolved, if you will. I've learned that God does, in fact, see color and respects it. I'm so glad that you go to a garden, there's not just one red rose, or you go to the ocean, there's not a great white shark, right? So it's an evolution. My heart was in the right place, but it was uninformed. And I know, Rachel, you've run into that as well with people doing what George is talking about. They may be well-meaning, but uninformed, and that's not helpful, is it?
Oh, yeah. The rallying cry of all lives matter. We're all people. Let's just embrace what we have in common, our shared humanity. We've accomplished so much. We've moved beyond. And, it's mainly white people like me who fall in this colorblindness stage because it's easier, right? Then we don't have to face the reality of the world around us and the systemic racism. And then we don't have to change. We don't have to do anything about it. So, I don't fault them. I was raised the same way where we were like, nothing's different. We're all the same. We're the melting pot, right? We all learned about that in school. And for me, I think the big change came when in high school, I moved to Okinawa, Japan, because my dad was serving with the Marine Corps. And I noticed that in the lunchroom, people separated themselves by their race. And so, and we all had different names for the groups that would gather. And I was like, there's something wrong with this. This is not the way we're supposed to be. Like, why can't we cross those lines? And a lot of people just wanted to remain colorblind and say, oh, it's not a big deal. This is okay. It's the way it should be. But that doesn't reflect the kingdom of God. So we definitely have a lot of work to do here. And something that I really appreciated about your book, George, was the way that you unpacked the reality of racism and the struggle that is ongoing to kind of help educate in a helpful way, people that don't really see it as an issue any longer, when it comes to education or healthcare or housing. So say more about that. What are ways or suggestions you have for those of us who are in ministry with or in relationships with people who are in that colorblind end of the spectrum?
The way I will look at it, there's three dimensions to talk about. So there's first historical racism. In other words, what's happened historically has impacted us. And the example I use in my classes, I talk about residual segregation. That probably where you're at, there's a Black part of town. If there's enough Hispanics, there's a Hispanic part of town. There's enough Asians, there's an Asian part of town. Well, that didn't happen by accident. There's not a tall part of town or a blonde part of town or anything like that. That happened due to historical segregation. And when we look at how that segregation occurred, whether it's from Jim Crow, whether it's from the development of the barrios, whether it's from the placement of Native American reservations, that was not an accident. And even though that was over then, it may not be as over today, the effects of it is still very real. And so I go through, some of the different costs. One example of the cost is because of the segregation, African Americans and Latino and Latinx population tend to go to schools that are inferior because they're in their neighborhood schools. So that's one. There's other costs. The second dynamic is the institutions. That there's institutions that play a role in reinforcing these racial distinctions. So just one example of that, our criminal justice system. We know that there are certain rules that disproportionately punish people of color. The classic case is crack versus powder cocaine. Powder cocaine is not punished as extensively as crack cocaine. And that African Americans who do use these drugs tend to use crack cocaine more than powder cocaine. Now, I suggest no one uses either one. I'm not advocating that. I'm saying that if you use crack, you're going to get a more extensive punishment if you use powder cocaine. The person administering the punishment may not themselves be racist or have any racial bias, but simply by administering the different punishments, they have the disproportionate impact on people of color. And then the third dynamic is that there is still a bias in our society. And one of the best examples of that is what they call an audit study. And so what they do is they have African Americans apply for a job and European Americans apply for a job. And Hispanic Americans apply for a job. And they show the race by things such as name. So that if you have someone there whose name's Leroy, people tend to think of that person as Black. Someone whose name is Bill, they think of that person as white. And so they use these cues. And what they find is that when it comes to calling people back for jobs, the person with the white sounding name, even when they control for everything else, so that credentially they're the same, they get called back for jobs more. So there's a bias that is there, even though people don't come out and use racial epithets or make racist statements. There's a bias that plays itself out in these sort of audit studies. So on these three different dimensions, we see that the notion of colorblindness and that we are all equal and with equal chances simply does not bear to reality.
George, in our first podcast of season 2, folks, if you didn't listen a couple weeks ago, we put it out. Go back because George unpacked anti-racism, got into CRT. Now we're on the colorblindness spectrum. I want to give you a chance, as we did in that first episode, George, because you're very clear that there's things to be learned on both sides of these equations, if you will, that there's strengths and weaknesses about both.
Yeah, and I'll just say, there are times where I am colorblind. And as I said this, the last show, when I'm grading my papers of my students, if I recognize the name and recognize the race, that I work on to have no impact on their grade. So there is a time and place for colorblindness. I'm not going to say that there's no time or place for colorblindness. There are times where, the military did something very interesting. The Army did something very interesting. They recognized the racial differences and they trained people up and then they let them compete. And when they let them compete, they were colorblind. And in that situation, I don't think I have a problem with that. So there are times and places. And sometimes colorblindness can help us to address some of the excesses of anti-racism. When we recognize, hey, look, this could be a time and place for that. So, I'm not going to say there's no place for that. What I'm going to say is, just like you can with anti-racism, when you take that and then try to apply that everywhere for all situations, then you get into the problems that I'm pointing out. You begin to argue that racism is not a problem when it truly is. And I will say this, there are times where people of color do what I would call play the race card. And that is looking for racism when it's not there in order to get themselves out. And one of the best examples I can think of, and I don't remember the name of this person, but like 20 years ago, there was an African-American who was a congressman who was caught in a situation of statutory rape. And he said that all the attention brought to him was due to racism. Well, I think at that point, you can play the colorblind card. I can think, no, you are with a 14-year-old. And we'll be doing this to you if you were white because you were with a 14-year-old. And so I think there is a time where you can use that to say, call out, when someone is playing the race card, which is looking for racism to get yourself out of the problem when racism is not the issue. But that obviously does not mean that it's always about colorblindness. And in fact, a lot of times it's not about colorblindness. So I would say to that person, and having talked with people like this, is I would try to show them situations where colorblindness does not work without denigrating them as a person for having these sort of ideas. And when I was teaching several years ago, one of the examples I showed to my Christian colleagues, to my Christians that I was talking to, white Christians, that colorblindness does not work, was pointing out research that shows that their white kids care more about the race of who they date than the faith of who they date. They're more open to dating someone of a different faith, of a different race. And when I pointed that out, they realized that just approaching things colorblindly was not, but they had a real problem of race among their kids, and they had to address that because their kids were more open to dating a non-Christian than someone of a different, than a non-white.
Yeah. So just a clarifying question then, George. In my mind, I agree with you. There are situations where it's most equitable to be colorblind and to say, I'm not going to judge this student's grade based on their name and therefore their implied race. But if someone operates and functions from a stance of colorblindness in all things because they were raised, aren't there I think there are like 10 states that are 88% or more white. So they don't even see people of other races. And so they just, live into that colorblindness and they don't realize that you can strategically apply it on occasion, but it should not be a way of life. That's a difference for you as well, right? Like if someone just lives and breathes colorblindness, then what would your suggestion be? Like, how do we help people like that realize that their good intention stance that, I love all people, might actually be causing harm to people of color?
Yeah, I think it's not realistic to think that your experience as a majority group member is going to be the same as for people of color. That your experience can work for you, and that's great. And things that you do that work for you is great, but it may not work for me as a person of color. And I would say that the way we get through to them is the way we get through to everyone is we can't just go to them and say, you're a bad person. And here's where I have a problem with anti-racism, which says, this is about white supremacy. Now, I know where they're coming from. I know that they're talking about a systematic way. But let's be realistic. When we say white supremacy, we're thinking KKK. In fact, I saw a meme, which I think is very unhelpful, that says that basically any opposition to CRT is like being part of the KKK. It has something like that. Or I think it's called KKK splaining or something like that. If you approach people that way, and what research shows, this is absolutely true, we get defensive and we literally cannot hear you. We literally cannot hear what you have to say because we become defensive. And so we have to give people full respect, fully humanize them, approach them with respect, build rapport, and then help to show them that their experiences may not work out. I'm interracially married. And, I'm not saying that, my wife married me and all of a sudden she was aware of racial issues because she had some awareness beforehand. But being married and me just talking about my experiences has given her a renewed awareness. And she grew up in a colorblind environment, being very colorblind, very conservative environment, but gave awareness that she sees things with a new light, especially now having kids of color. We have that rapport. She knows my experiences. And that makes all the difference in the world.
George, that makes me think of the seeming inability of this country in this moment to think critically, to navigate nuance, and the overgeneralization and or dogmatic statements that come from all corners of society today use the word not helpful. I think you'll get into that with some of the language, some of the approach in our next podcast. on mutual accountability, but staying with this idea of being unhelpful, talk a little bit about the navigation of the nuance as we approach people in order to be heard and to, in a sense, win them. So in this case, how can we approach people, particularly white people at the colorblind level, to help them hear this message and ultimately to see what it is they don't see?
Yeah, I think this is why we have to listen to people, because we have to talk to people in a way that they can hear us. And all of us are married. And so we know that sometimes we talk to our spouses and they can't hear us, then things just get worse. And so we have to learn about our spouse and learn how what works, what doesn't work, and then talk to them in a way that they hear us. Well, it's the same thing. If I'm looking at a white person and all I see is an oppressor, and that's the only image I have, and I've dehumanized them, that's all I made them out to be. So I told them, I said, they're an oppressor. I'm not going to reach them. All I'm going to do is create more havoc. If I see them as a man or woman of God, and so I want, for their sake, to reach them, so for them to become more human, more of a person of God, then I'm going to try to figure out how I can reach them. And that's why I started using my example of what about your kids? You want your kids to marry a Christian? Well, right now, the way y'all are doing things, your kids are more likely to marry a non-Christian because they're not going to want to marry outside their race. They're not open to marrying a Black Christian person because they'll rather marry a white non-Christian person, a white atheist person. That, because I knew from talking to them that they cared a lot about that. So we got to figure out what people care about. We have to take the time to get to know them as a person and not a caricature. And I think that's critically important. Social media has been brought up a couple of times. I used to be one of the social media warriors, where I go on and unfortunately or fortunately, however you want to think about it, I grew up learning how to play the dozens, which in Black vernacular means I learned how to do insults pretty darn well. And so, I'd go on and something and I would argue and I think a few months ago, I just came to the realization, what good is that? I don't know this person. They don't know me. We have no relationship with one another. We're trying to win the battle, win the argument, rather than caring about one another. And so I'm not saying people can't do that. I don't want to put a burden on someone else that is my own burden, but I'm much more careful on how I interact with people today, because there's another human who's typing that, and they have their own concerns, and their concerns to them are just as important as my concerns to me, and I need to respect that. And if I learn from them, I find that usually when I make connections with people, they become more aware. They don't necessarily come to where I am, and that's fine. I sometimes learn from them. I don't come exactly where they're at. But I learn on how to connect with them. And that's part of what we need to be doing. Trying to develop that sort of rapport, that relationship, and teaching through that.
So one last question, because relationships, that's like what faith is all about, right? Like that's why God sent Jesus, so that we could have this relationship repaired and grow and be transformed. So as I think about this issue of color blindness, and over the last few years, I feel like there has been a lot of name calling, back and forth, especially on social media. I remember I posted on a friend's page, well, maybe Black lives do matter. I kind of believe in that. And they said, oh, you're probably a baby killer too, right? And so we just assume so much about each other, and we throw names around, and it becomes so polarizing and not helpful. I wonder what the role is, like as we're listening and learning in relationships, what is the role of accountability too? Because what's helped me at times is to say, with some of my dear friends, family members, anybody, in the church who might be experiencing color blindness, I'll say, what, can I just repeat back to you what I heard you say or what I heard you post on Facebook, and tell you how I experienced that and how I perceive that as being racist, even unintentionally? Like, can we have a conversation about this? That sometimes there's less defensiveness when it comes from me, because otherwise they might say, oh, well, you're just playing the race card, or you're, this, that, or the other. So how does accountability fit into color blindness? Even as we're seeking the relationships, at what point do we say, listen, this isn't reflecting God's principles?
Well, what you just did was called active listening, which is what you just did is, you said, here's what I hear you say. And then they have a chance to say, oh, I didn't mean that. Or maybe they didn't mean that. And then, and I think that's part of it. I do think there's an accountability element. I think we all have an accountability element. When I've heard you, I'm accountable for what you've just told me. Now, that does not mean I have to agree with you 100%, because then we get back into my role is to just capitulate to what you want, and that can't be my role. But that means that if I'm going to try to figure out solutions, I have to account for what you just told me in that solution. And when we get to it, when we look at the mutual responsibility model, that's exactly what it's about. It's not just about relationships, even though they're very critically important. It's also about productive relationships where we can find solutions that are sustainable because we have buy-in, because everyone had a say in what that is. And in that solution, I have to figure out what you told me and what we can do to address those sort of needs.
It's tragic to me in the 21st century, some 2,000 years after Christ, something as simple as written by the Apostle Paul, Philippians chapter 2, do not merely think about your own personal interests, but also for the interests of others. I mean, that is a core tenet of our faith. It's right there in the Word of God, Philippians 2. And it's almost like we aren't even thinking about that today. We're not even living like that. And just that simple idea of active listening, as you're bringing up both Rachel and George, it really does put us, hey, I can't just think about my own personal interests. I got to get in your frame, understand what it is you're saying, walk in your shoes, so to speak, to the degree I can, and move away from just my perspective dominates all the way to where Christ would want me to be. Because at the end of the day, we are commanded to be ambassadors of Christ, ministers of reconciliation, and to play by the rules of the good book, if you will, not by the rules of Facebook. So having said all that, let me give a little closing thought, because a person on Facebook that I recently started following, they posted this, Shimamanda Adichie. Apparently she's followed by 1.5 million people or something. But this is what she said. The danger of a single story is that it creates stereotype. And the problem with stereotype is not that they are untrue, but they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. Stories, she says, can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity. When we reject a single story, when we realize that there is never a single story about any place or people, we regain a kind of paradise.
I appreciate that quote, and I think it applies in a lot of aspects of our lives, right? If you're only watching one news station, that could be a problem. If you're only reading one book about the problem of race and it falls on one side of the spectrum or the other, that's a disservice. There's a reason we have 4 gospel accounts of the life of Jesus, because we needed to hear different voices, different experiences of the same exact event in many times, especially in the synoptics, so that we could get a deeper view of who Christ was and what the mission of Christ was. So I love that. Thanks for sharing that, Mark. And thank you so much, George, for being with us. I'm grateful for the shared experience of conversing today with you and George about color blindness. We're grateful to all of our listeners and hope that you join us for our next episode with George, where we'll unpack mutual accountability, mutual responsibility, what that means, what that looks like, how we can live into that approach. So thanks again for joining us at Mosaix Today with Rachel and Mark.
You've been listening to Mosaix Today with Rachel and Mark. Take a moment to like, leave a comment, and subscribe to this podcast. To learn more about who we are, what we do, and why, visit mosaixtoday.info. That's mosaixtoday.info. I'm Alex Diaz. We'll see you next time on Mosaix Today.